the judge barked. "Remove that ridiculous hat. This is a court of law." The royal guard said nothing, but when he was finally allowed to speak, the entire courtroom rose to their feet and applauded. So what exactly were his words? Before we reveal that, press the subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. It was just after 7:30 a.m., and the barracks were still half-silent cold cereal in bowls, boots not yet polished, and the usual muttered banter shared between men trained to keep emotion in check. Lance Sergeant Thomas Alden was sitting near the window, the soft gray light casting long shadows across the guardroom tiles. He had just poured the milk when the door swung open. "Mail doesn't come this early," Wicks muttered from the other side of the table. But it wasn't mail. It was a court summons hand-delivered, sealed in cream-colored parchment, and addressed not just to Mr. Alden, but to Lance Sergeant Thomas Alden, Coldstream Guards, Horse Guards, Division. That formality alone set the room's tone on edge. He opened it slowly. The others watched in silence as his brow furrowed, then flattened. "What is it?" asked Private Keene, always too quick with questions. Calden read it aloud, his voice calm. "Requested appearance before Westminster Magistrates' Court. Case: civilian complaint filed against ceremonial interference." Wicks scoffed. "Ceremonial interference? What in the hell does that even mean?" Alden folded the letter and slid it back into the envelope. "Apparently," he said, "I upset someone. That someone," they later learned, was a solicitor named Bernard Hemsworth, a well-connected man known for making noise about British institutions needing to modernize. The son of a factory foreman who'd clawed his way through law school on scholarships. Hemsworth had spent the last 30 years overcompensating for his working-class roots by publicly challenging anything he deemed outdated. Guards, with their unchanging uniforms and ancient protocols, represented everything he'd been trying to distance himself from since his Oxford admission interview. 2 weeks prior, during a particularly rainy afternoon at the mall, Hemsworth had tried to cut through a restricted ceremonial path near the Victoria Memorial. He'd been late for a meeting with a client, some minor peer with more titles than Sensend. The official route would have added precious minutes to his journey. Calden, standing post at the time, had stepped into his path without a word. The umbrella had gone flying. The lawyer had nearly lost his footing. And in the shuffle, something about Alden's overbearing stature and psychologically intimidating attire had been recorded in Hemsworth's written complaint. What the complaint hadn't mentioned was the stream of insults. Hemsworth had spat at Alden while brushing down his 1,000-pound suit, or how he'd demanded the guard's name and number with the entitled fury of a man not used to being told no. Alden had remained silent throughout ties forward, following protocol. That silence, more than anything, had infuriated Hemsworth. "He's suing you for wearing your bearskin hat," Keene said, incredulous. Alden nodded once. By 09 ORs, the commander had received official confirmation. The court had granted Hemsworth a hearing, no military exemption, no internal resolution, just an assigned appearance date with a stern advisory. Arrive in standard ceremonial uniform. "You're joking," Wicks said later in the locker room. "They want you to show up to court wearing the exact thing the man complained about." "Orders are orders," Alden replied, his voice even. "Protocol states full dress unless otherwise specified." The news spread quickly. Some guardsmen laughed it off, others looked worried. But Alden, he remained unmoved, same as he had during 23-gun salutes and anti-monarchist hecklers, because he knew something most people forget. Tradition doesn't bend just because someone yells louder than the rest. The morning of the hearing, Alden woke at 0500 hours as he had every day for the past 7 years. Military habits die hard. He spent 45 minutes in the small gym they'd built on base. running through the same routine that had kept him steady since Afghanistan. Deadlifts, pull-ups, the exercises that reminded his body it was still capable, still strong. By 0645, he was in the showers, letting the scalding water wash away the pre-dawn workout, thinking about the day ahead. Some of his fellow guards had offered to come with him to court moral support. They'd called it. But Alden had declined. This was something he needed to do alone. Rain pelted against the barracks windows, but by 0900 hours, it had cleared to a dull gray, overcast, the kind of London weather that makes everything look like an old photograph. Alden stood before the full-length mirror in the preparation room, adjusting his ceremonial dress with the same precision he'd maintained for the past 7 years. Scarlet tunic pressed to parade perfection, white leather belts snug at the waist, gloves tight, boots mirror-shined to the point where they reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above, and rising above his already formidable frame his bearskin, towering and severe, adding 18 inches to his 6-foot height. He studied his reflection for a moment, not out of vanity, but to ensure everything was regulation. The brass buttons aligned perfectly. The medals sat exactly where they should. Connection to every guardsman who had stood before him right back to Wellington's time. "You know," said Corporal Matthews, watching from the doorway, "there's still time to file for an exemption. The old man would sign off on it." Alden made one final adjustment to his tunic. "Wouldn't change anything," he replied. "They'll have to see what they're asking me to take off. The courtroom wasn't built for men like Alden. Westminster Magistrates' Court was one of those old buildings, red brick on the outside, pre-war institutional gray on the inside, narrow hallways, low ceilings, wooden benches polished smooth by generations of nervous hands, a place designed to humble, to miniaturize, to remind everyone who really held the authority. But when Lance Sergeant Thomas Alden stepped through the double doors, the room shrank around him. The courtroom chatter slowed immediately. People turned. A woman near the front row whispered something to her child, who froze mid. Even the court clerk hesitated before announcing, "The defendant is present." Alden offered no acknowledgment. He walked with exact, measured steps, on echoing across the parquet floor. He did not remove his bearskin. He did not slouch. He stood beside the defense table without fuss or noise, hands clasped behind his back, chin level, eyes forward, every inch of him regulation, every second of his presence protocol. In the gallery, cameras were forbidden, but that didn't stop phones from quietly buzzing beneath handbags and jacket sleeves. A few journalists who'd caught wind of the hearing scribbled furious shorthand, sensing something viral in the making. Kit at the prosecution table. Bernard Hemsworth adjusted his collar repeatedly, a nervous tell he'd developed during his early years at the bar. The man was thin, with skin like wax, and a suit that shouted money. His barrister younger man in robes named Jeremy Phillips, fresh out of chambers and eager to impress his first senior client, leaned in and whispered something about precedent and case law. Hemsworth barely nodded. His gaze never left Alden. To others in the room, Hemsworth appeared confident, even defiant. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tremor in his left hand, the one he'd kept out of sight since entering the courtroom. The truth was, seeing Alden in full ceremonial uniform had triggered something unexpected in him. Memories of childhood remembrance, days watching his father. A man who'd rarely shown emotion, standing rigid and silent during the 2-minute silence. Eyes glistening with tears he'd never explained. Hemsworth had spent decades pushing away those working-class roots. But something about Alden's presence brought them flooding back. Instead of dealing with that discomfort, he'd chosen to attack it. It was easier to tear down tradition than to admit it still moved you. The judge entered, robes swishing. Everyone stood. "Be seated," she said, scanning the room before her eyes caught on Alden. "Well, I believe the dress code has been observed." A murmur of restrained amusement passed through the gallery. Alden remained stone-faced. "Mr. Hemsworth," the judge continued, tone tightening, "you've requested this hearing on the grounds that a member of the Kingsguard intentionally intimidated you in public space. You claim his militarized display constituted an act of psychological aggression. Is that still your position?" Hemsworth stood stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor. I contend that his appearance, specifically that outlandishly oversized hat, was a deliberate attempt to obstruct, to provoke, and to humiliate. And," she said carefully, "you're requesting the court recommend modifications to ceremonial uniform policy." "I am. At minimum, that this bearskin tradition be deemed incompatible with civilian spaces." The room exhaled quietly, sharply. The judge turned toward Alden. "Lance Sergeant, do you understand the complaint brought against you?" "Yes, ma'am," Alden replied, calm, controlled. "Will you be offering a defense?" "I will," he said, then added, without blinking, "by standing still." The room was already quiet, but the silence that followed. Alden's words felt different, thicker, the kind that makes you feel the sound of your own breath. Even the gallery seemed unsure whether to laugh or listen. The judge adjusted her glasses. "You mean that literally, Lance Sergeant?" "Yes, ma'am," Alden said, still not turning his head. "I've stood in silence in front of Buckingham Palace for 6 hours at a time in the pouring rain, with football chants in one ear and tourists trying to knock me off balance in the other. This," he motioned slightly toward the room with his eyes, not his body, "isn't unusual." A smirk flickered across the judge's face, but only for a second. She tapped her pen once against her desk. "Very well, then. Let us proceed." Hemsworth stood again, this time with theatrical stiffness. "Your Honor, may I speak freely?" "Cautiously," she replied, half amused. "I've served this country for 30 years in public service. I've represented Parliament in international negotiations. I've defended free speech and mediated trade disputes. And yet today I walked into this courtroom and felt small in the presence of a costume." He turned to Alden, gesturing as if delivering a lecture to a classroom. "That bearskin you wear is an antique relic. It obstructs visibility. It inflates presence. It's designed to make civilians feel inferior. And in civilian space, especially a court of law, that's not tradition. That's intimidation." Alden didn't flinch, didn't respond. Hemsworth scoffed. "See, this is exactly the behavior I'm referring to. The mask of stillness. The emotional manipulation. It's military theater and, frankly, Your Honor, I find it contemptuous of this court." The judge leaned back in her chair, steepling her fingers. "You find the uniform itself contemptuous?" "I do." The judge turned back to Alden. "Lance Sergeant, do you wear that uniform by choice?" "No, ma'am," Alden replied. "I wear it because it represents those who came beforehand, those who didn't come home." Something shifted in the room. The gallery stirred, the older spectators, the veterans, the history teachers. The woman with a poppy pinned to her scarf sat a little straighter. It was as if Alden's words had opened a door that had been locked on suddenly. Everyone remembered why men like him stood in uniform in the first place. The judge eyed Hemsworth. "You're accusing this man of psychological manipulation by wearing the uniform he is duty-bound to wear." Hemsworth straightened his tie. "I am." "Noted," the judge said sharply. "But let me remind the court, we are not in a theater. We are in a building older than half the laws on our books. And in this space, if anything, the sight of discipline and order is not a threat. It is a reminder." She leaned forward, her voice carrying new weight. "And I, for one, am not in the business of asking soldiers to apologize for standing straight." Behind that impassive exterior, behind the ceremonial stillness that had become his armor, Alden felt memories stirring, uninvited and unwelcome. They always came when the room got too quiet, when people started asking why he stood like a statue, or what made a man wear a hat that heavy in August. Kandahar Duaribus Puluk. It was 48 degrees in the shade. The air inside the armored vehicle was thick with diesel fumes, blood, and fear. Private Marcus Alden 19, barely through basic, was pressed between sandbags and a trembling signaller who wouldn't stop whispering his mother's name. "Stay still." The sergeant had hissed over, "If they think the vehicle's dead, they might pass us," so Alden did. He didn't breathe too loud, didn't twitch, didn't flinch when the grenade detonated 10 feet from the hall and showered them in dirt and shrapnel. He stayed frozen in that position for almost 45 minutes, legs cramping, back seizing, fingers going numb from clenching his weapon too tightly. That wasn't discipline for show. That was survival. They called it ghost posture sitting, so still you weren't a soldier anymore. You were part of the wreckage. Later, when they cleared the compound and counted the bodies, the commanding officer shook Alden's hand and said, "I've never seen stillness used as a weapon before. People never understood. They thought stillness was weakness, a symptom of compliance, an act. But real stillness, the kind carved into your bones through hours of training and moments of terror, that was a form of strength no courtroom insult could touch." He joined the household division after recovery, transferred to ceremonial duty not as retirement, but as responsibility, because no one ever talked about what happened after war, how sometimes the only way to stay sane was to find structure, precision, silence. Alden chose the guards not to be looked at, but to keep from looking back. The bearskin wasn't a costume to him. It was armor, tradition, memory. The court clerk called the next witness, and Alden didn't move, didn't react. He simply stood, bearing not just the weight of his uniform, but everything that had come before it. The case being heard that day was small in scale, civil disturbance, trespassing, some minor scuffle in a park, but none of that mattered, not really. The room wasn't waiting for a verdict. Kit was waiting for a decision whether Alden would be allowed to continue standing as he was, whether his hat, his duty, belonged in that courtroom. The defendant was mid-testimony a local activist named Connor Ree, arms folded, gaze drifting toward the press row every few seconds. His solicitor had already attempted to argue the guardsman's presence was intimidating, that it skewed the tone of the court. Intimidating, Alden thought, not without irony. He hadn't spoken a word, hadn't moved. The judge interrupted mid-question again, turning to Alden. "You are not above this court, guardsman. That hat may carry symbolic weight on parade grounds, but it carries none here. Remove it." Alden remained still. The silence that followed was heavier than before. This time it was broken not by the judge but by a quiet voice from the gallery. "If I may," a man had risen from the third, elderly, distinguished, silver hair, dark blue suit with an unassuming red and gold regimental pin. Several barristers glanced his way, recognizing the insignia before the face. It was retired Brigadier Simon Hargreaves. The judge narrowed her eyes. "You are not counsel in this matter, sir, I know, but you are publicly challenging the bearing of a member of the King's Guard, and I believe I may offer clarity as a former commander of the household division." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Then the judge hesitated. "You have 30 seconds." Hargreaves walked with precision as he approached the bench, not dramatic, not rushed, just purposeful. He didn't face the judge immediately. He turned instead to face Alden. "Guardsman," he said with the kind of authority that never quite leaves a man, "state your regimental post." "Grenadier Guards, 2nd Battalion, attached to ceremonial rotation, active service until 2012, sir. And your orders today." to stand sentry outside this courtroom during the remand of Crown versus Ree, maintaining full ceremonial uniform and posture as instructed by the barracks commander. Sir? Hargreaves nodded once stern to the judge. He's not here for show, Your Honor. He's here because some of us believe duty shouldn't end when the uniform leaves the parade ground. He's here, Hargreaves added, voice rising just enough to reach the spectators, because in a world that forgets quickly, men like him choose to remember, visibly. The room was stone silent. Then, slowly, people began to rise. First a retired sergeant in the back row, then a young veteran seated beside the clerk. One by one, civilians and soldiers alike stood not in protest, in respect. Even the defendant looked over, genuinely stunned by the shift. The judge didn't say a word, but she didn't ask Alden to remove his hat again. For a moment it felt like time itself had stalled. No voices, no shuffling, no murmurs. Just the sound of breath held tight as if no one wanted to be the first to break whatever spell had fallen over the room. Then it happened. A single, solitary clap. It came from the public gallery, a woman in her 60s, seated beside the aisle, eyes brimming with something between pride and memory. She clapped once more, deliberate, firm. Then someone else joined in. Then another. And another. In seconds, the courtroom that had moments ago been rigid with protocol had erupted not into applause, but into recognition. It wasn't cheering. It wasn't celebratory. It was something deeper, something older, a slow building, reverent ovation that rippled through the chamber like a tide turning back against the shore. Even the court clerk, bound by stricter codes than most, allowed himself a quiet nod, his eyes momentarily lingering on Alden as if seeing him for the first time. Alden didn't move. He couldn't. He wouldn't. But behind that impassive exterior, something in him stirred. Not pride, exactly. Something heavier. The ache of years spent invisible in a uniform everyone noticed but few understood. The judge, to her credit, didn't slam the gavel. She didn't bark orders. She simply sat back watching, perhaps remembering a father or grandfather, perhaps realizing that in all her years of law she'd never witnessed something quite like this. Brigadier Hargreaves cleared his throat. "With the court's permission, I'll take my seat." The judge gestured silently, still fixed on Alden. A young woman from the press box scribbled furiously into a notepad, her earlier cynicism replaced by something closer to awe. Even the defendant, Ree, leaned forward on the table, elbows resting on one wood, suddenly more interested in the soldier before him than in his own hearing. When the clapping faded, the judge finally spoke. "Lance Sergeant Alden," she said slowly, deliberately, "you may remain as you are. The court now understands." And just like that a moment passed. But no one in that room would forget it. Because in a world that asked men like Alden to fade quietly into ceremony, to be seen but not heard, admired but never truly respected, he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't offered a speech, hadn't even moved. He just stood, calm, and somehow it was enough to make the whole room rise to meet him. The black car hummed through the damp London streets like a whisper lost in fog. Rain tapped gently against the windows, blurring the streetlights into soft amber smudges. Inside the rear compartment, Alden sat in full uniform, still wearing the bearskin, the weight of the day settling on his shoulders differently now. He hadn't spoken since leaving the courtroom, but his mind was churning. The sound of that applause, not the perfunctory clapping you heard after ceremonial events, but something deeper, more personal still, echoed in his ears. For 7 years he'd stood at various posts around London, watching thousands of people take photos, hearing countless comments. But today was different. Today people had seen him. Beside him sat Brigadier Hargreaves, posture formal, though the tension in his jaw had eased. The brigadier had slipped into the car wordlessly after the hearing, simply nodding at Alden, before settling into his seat. For several minutes neither man said a word. The driver ex-Royal Artillery, from the way he adjusted his mirrors, and the subtle way he held the wheel, knew better than to interrupt that silence. "Kuna." "You know," Hargreaves finally said, breaking the quiet, "when I commanded the household division, I used to worry we were becoming anachronisms, living museums. The world's moving so fast, and there we stood, unchanged." Alden glanced at him but said nothing. "Today," the brigadier continued, "I realized we're not anachronisms, we're anchors. In a world where nothing's permanent, where everything's disposable and forgettable, we're the things that stay, that matter. People need that more than they admit. Somewhere near Trafalgar Square, they hit traffic up protest. It looked like something about climate change. Young faces pressed against windows, colorful signs wobbling in the air. Alden watched them through the rain-streaked glass, thinking about how different their world was from his ... how necessary both worlds were. Finally, Hargreaves cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice low, "that was unorthodox." Alden didn't reply. He kept his eyes forward, posture unchanged, but the corner of his mouth twitched just slightly. "I've sat through more hearings than I can count," Hargreaves continued, "but I've never seen a room come to attention without a bugle." Still no answer. Hargreaves leaned back, exhaling through his nose. "I suppose you didn't do it for applause?" "No, sir." "You didn't do it to make a point?" "No, sir." "Then why?" The brigadier asked, not challengingly, but curiously, genuinely. Alden turned his head slowly. His voice was calm. "Matter of fact ... because if I took it off to please a courtroom, I'd have to take it off in my head too, and I'm not ready to do that." That landed with weight. Hargreaves nodded once slowly. "Well said." The rest of the ride passed in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable but filled with understanding. As the car turned onto Birdcage Walk, approaching Wellington Barracks, Alden finally relaxed his shoulders just a fraction. Just enough. The rain had stopped by the time they pulled up to the gate. The clouds were beginning to part above St. James's Park, and pale sunlight glinted off the wet cobblestones. The driver got out and opened the door. Alden stepped down, adjusted his gloves, and turned back to the brigadier. "Permission to resume post, sir." Hargreaves gave a faint smile. "Granted." Alden walked toward the barracks, not slowly, not proudly, just as he always did. With precision, with silence, with that same weight he'd carried all day. Inside the building, soldiers were gathered around a small TV in the common room. The courtroom footage had somehow made it onto the news already. Some journalist had grabbed a decent angle despite the no recording rules. The volume was low, but you could see the moment clearly. The spontaneous standing ... the applause. Alden remaining perfectly still throughout it all. When Alden entered, the room went quiet. No one clapped. No one joked. But there was something different in their easy mix of respect and curiosity. These men knew Alden, had served alongside him for years. But today they'd seen something else ... Not the quiet guard who always took the extra shift. Not the man who helped others with their kit preparation without being asked. Bat, the living embodiment of what they all represented. Private Keene, the same one who'd asked too many questions that morning, looked up from where he'd been pretending to read a magazine. "Mate," he said simply. It wasn't much, but from Keene it was everything. One of the younger guards, a fresh-faced recruit named Foster, who still looked 12 in civilian clothes, stepped aside and offered Alden the best seat in the room, the worn leather chair everyone fought over during evening downtime, positioned perfectly for TV viewing. Alden nodded his thanks. He didn't take the seat. Instead, He moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where other guards were practicing drill movements in the fading daylight. Their precision was beautiful. Every movement synchronized. Every step measured. This was what he'd defended today. Not just in court, but in that entire strange, charged moment when the room had risen to its feet. "Lance Sergeant," Foster ventured. "Your bearskin, sir, don't. You want to—" Alden met his eyes in the window's reflection. "Not yet, lad. Not quite yet." He stood there still in full uniform, watching his brothers practice the ancient routines that would never grow old. The weight of history and tradition sat comfortably on his head like it always had. Only now he carried the weight of something more. The knowledge that sometimes standing still was the most powerful thing you could do. Would you have removed the hat just to avoid judgment, or would you have stood tall, knowing exactly what that uniform means, even if the whole room misunderstood you? Let us know in the comments. We read every single one. If this story gave you a new respect for the Royal Guard and the discipline they carry not just on parade, but in principle, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Make sure you're subscribed and press the bell icon so you never miss one of our daily uploads. And if you know someone who thinks ceremonial soldiers are just for show, send them this video. Let them see what duty really looks like under pressure. Our other Royal Guard stories are popping up on your screen. Now check those out next. And we'll see you tomorrow same time with another story that proves silence isn't weakness. It's conviction.